Good morning once again, leaders. I am May Ann Singson, together with my group mates Ma'am Samara and Sister Marissa. We are the Group 9 reporters, and today we will discuss another important topic entitled Instructional Learning Processes. Under this topic, we will tackle learning objectives, teaching content, and lesson planning, which also includes pre-planning, lesson planning, implementation, and evaluation. Let us begin by presenting our learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, the student should be able to explain accurately what is instructional learning processes. Second, demonstrate an appreciation for the importance of lesson planning by attentively listening during discussions. And define correctly what learning objectives and teaching content are. Now, before we dive into our discussion, let me ask you this question. In your own opinion, how should a teacher begin a lesson? I'm confident that all of you as future educators have bright ideas about this. I also know that your opinions may differ, but to support the ideas you've already built, let's explore this lesson and discover how a teacher should properly begin a lesson. First, let's define what we mean by instructional learning processes. So, it is a process of involving students on how learning should begin, how learning should start, how teaching should also start, and how both processes will end. It is an interaction between teachers and learners. So, we are talking about a series or procedure, a process, a methods that outline how learning should begin, how teaching should start, and how to effectively help students gain essential knowledge or skills. For example, as future teachers, before we teach our students, we should carefully plan our instructions. There are several factors to consider when planning and developing our lessons. In particular, since we are in the 21st century, it is crucial that our instructions and activities will be focused on addressing the students' learning needs. Now, it states here, it is an interaction between teachers and learners, meaning it is not only the teachers will be involved in the said process, but both the teacher and the students are part of the process from the beginning until the end of learning. So, I have some steps involved in the instructional learning processes. But before I proceed, please remember that instructional plans are always aligned with the curriculum. When a teacher is planning or implementing the process, they must strictly follow the curriculum, which serves as the guide or outline of what students need to learn for a particular year or course. This means that when a teacher plans lessons or activities, they should always stick to the curriculum and not just do things randomly. So first, assessing learning needs. It is very important to first assess our students' learning needs, interests, learning styles, and other factors including their prior knowledge of the subject. We can only do this effectively if we interact our students and build rapport with them. Why? Because the information we gather from assessing their needs will help us plan the rest of our lessons. And once we understand their needs, we can now proceed to number 2, establishing learning objectives. We can now establish our learning objectives based on what we want our students to achieve. Since we already know what we need or what they need and the essential knowledge they require, we can now develop strategies that suit to their needs. And that is step number 3, developing teaching strategies. Of course, these strategies should align with the curriculum guidelines and be flexible enough to adapt to the students' unique requirements. After setting the objectives and strategies, we can now deliver the lessons or instructions to our students, and that is number 4. And number 5, engaging students in practice. It is also important to ensure that students are actively engaged in the class. Remember, we are implementing learner-centered instruction. Ask questions that encourage critical thinking and provide activities that align with your learning objectives. Now, number 6, feedback. After giving activities, always provide feedback that is concise, timely, and clear. Feedback should focus on effort and strategies to help students improve their performance. Always let them know which areas they need to work on, how they can improve, and what strengths you see in them. Positive feedback motivates students to do better. Next, evaluate the outcomes of your teaching and the students' learning. Check if your students are achieving the learning objectives. if your teaching strategies are effective, and if the lesson goals were met. Based on this evaluation, you can now plan your next steps. That is number 8. Plan your next steps. If needed, revise your strategies or make adjustments to ensure your instructions are effective in future lessons. Next, instructional learning processes have subpoints. One of them is learning objectives. So when we say learning objectives, it should be brief, clear, and specific statements of what learners will be able to do at the end of the lesson as a result of the activities, teaching, and learning that has taken place. It is very familiar to us. Before we start our discussion, we have first our learning objectives. And a very crucial reason behind why we always present first our objectives because we want our learners to understand or know what we want them to do or to learn after the discussions. We should always take note that when making objectives, it should always be short, concise, clear, and specific, meaning direct to the point. Now, there are 4 components of learning objectives that we need to consider. First, the audience. Always specify the audience they are intended to serve. Of course, we should always consider for whom the objectives are being made. This is to ensure that we create objectives that are relevant to our audience. Second, behavior. Carefully choose the right words that describes the behavior of the students after the discussion. Here, we should carefully describe what we want our students to do after discussing the lesson. It should clearly express the action that shows the student has really learned or understood the material. We can use words like explain, identify, or demonstrate. Third, we have standard. Identify to what standard a given knowledge must be achieved by the learners. Now, this refers to the level or quality of performance expected from the learners or how well they should perform. Lastly, we have condition. Condition specifies the conditions under which given task should be performed, meaning it could include the circumstances or resources used to complete the task. Now, to understand this better, I have an example of my learning objectives approved by Sir Genesis. First, I identify my audience. Of course, it's meant for my grade 7 students. Then, I carefully choose the words to describe my students' behavior. For instance, I use words like write, identify, and demonstrate. Next, I set the standard for how well they should perform the task. For example, I use accurately to emphasize how they should identify something or correctly to stress how they should write something. Lastly, I set the condition under which my task should be given rather. For instance, I state through active participation in various activities or through completing written activities. Moving on, I have a list of the guiding principles in determining and formulating learning objectives. So, number 1, begin with the end in mind. This is actually a quote from Dr. Stephen Covey. Begin with the end in mind. This means we should always have clearly defined goals before starting anything. What do you want to happen? What result do you aim for? As a teacher, this means we should always begin our lessons with clearly defined specific lesson objectives so that our students know exactly what they are expected to learn after the lesson. Second, share lesson objectives with students. Of course, students should always know objectives before the class starts so they will be aware of what to focus on. That's why we let them read the learning objectives beforehand. Number 3, lesson objectives must be in 2 or 3 domains. Remember the CAP, cognitive, mental, affective, emotion, and psychomotor skills from Bloom's Taxonomy by Benjamin Bloom. Number 4, work on significant and relevant lesson objectives. Lessons should always be relevant. Discussion must be based on the approved curriculum. Number 5, lesson objectives must be aligned with the aims of education. We also need to consider the vision and mission of our educational institutions. Every institution has its own mission and vision, like Green Valley College. It serves as a foundation for course objectives. This means that what students learn should align with the intended educational purpose of the institution. Number six, aim at the development of critical and creative thinking. The objectives we create must challenge students to enhance their critical thinking, their reasoning, and creativity. Lastly, for accountability of learning lesson objective must be SMART. Yes, SMART. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. Specific. They must be direct and concise. For example, instead of saying students will understand the concept of, for example, Marxism, specify how they will demonstrate understanding. Like, students will explain the concept of Marxism. Measurable. You should be something you can assess. Attainable. The objective must be realistic and reasonable. Can your students accomplish them? Relevant. You should focus on what you want your students to achieve and support their learning needs. And lastly, time bound. They must have a clear time frame or deadline. That's why we always begin objectives with phrases like, at the end of the lesson, the students will. So, I hope you understand it. So much for that. Let's proceed to teaching content. So, teaching content refers to the subject matter, skills, concepts, and information that educators aim to teach to their students. So, in the word itself, content, it refers to the overall information, the materials or body of knowledge, such as the topics, the skills, and ideas that the teacher plans to cover in a lesson. It's what the students are expected to learn. Now, teaching content includes the topics, the skills, and information covered during instruction. It should be aligned with the goals and objectives of the basic education curriculum and response to the needs of the learners. Yes, it should always directly support or align with the basic education curriculum. In simple terms, everything a teacher teaches should help students achieve the objectives outlined by the curriculum. It's important to ensure that the materials are relevant and beneficial to their learning needs. Lastly, it includes cognitive, psychomotor, and affective elements. Like what I have said, it should always cover the COP, the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains. Cognitive, explaining the concepts, the ideas, and information. When we say affective, helps develop the positive attitudes towards the topics. And when we say psychomotor, practicing and applying the skills they've learned. That's all for my part. Sister Marisa will now continue discussing the next topic.
Lesson planning, a systematic process that teachers follow to design and deliver instruction. So when you speak about lesson planning, is the process or organizing and structuring the content, like for example, the activities and strategies that you would use during a lesson to ensure students and can achieve also the learning objectives. So in lesson planning, we have involved several stages, which is the pre-planning, lesson planning, implementation, and evaluation. What do you mean pre-planning? Gathering information about the learners, including their prior knowledge, interests, and learning needs. So teachers also review the curriculum standards and learning objectives during this phase. And also it helps educators to tailor their lessons to meet the unique needs of their students. So one of the examples of this pre-planning is to identify the learning objectives and to determine what you want your student to achieve by the end of the lessons. For example, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to solve the learning equations. So lesson planning, teachers outline the structure of the lesson, including the instructions, development, and conclusion. So teachers select teaching methods, materials, and activities that align with the learning objectives and content. And also, teachers also consider how to differentiate instruction to cater to diverse learning styles and abilities. So one of the examples of the lesson planning is to create a lesson outline, which is to develop step-by-step plan for your lesson. So this includes an introduction, that main content or activities, and conclusion.
So, implementation. The execution phase where teachers deliver the lesson to students. Effective implementation requires teachers to engage students, manage the classroom effectively, and use a variety of instructional strategies to support learning. Teachers should be flexible and ready to make adjustments as needed to ensure that all students can achieve the learning activity, the learning objectives. The implementation phase refers to the stage where teachers actively deliver the planned lesson to students. During this phase, teachers present the content, facilitate learning activities, and engage students in discussions or exercises to help them grasp the concepts. It is the phase where the lesson plan is put into action and where teaching strategies are applied to ensure effective learning. So, evaluation. Teachers assess student learning to determine whether the learning objective have been met. Can be done through formal assessments such as tests or quizzes, or informal methods such as observations and discussions. Helps teachers to reflect on the effectiveness of their instruction and to identify areas for improvement. Evaluation is the process where teachers assess student learning to determine if the learning objectives have been achieved. This can be done through formal assessments like tests or quizzes, or informal methods like observations and discussions. It also allows teachers to reflect on their teaching effectiveness and identify areas for improvement.